Her defiance would not be paid for in blood, but in a lifetime of shame. For refusing an arranged marriage, her family delivered her to the convent gates. They would erase her name, bury her spirit beneath vows of silence and poverty, and lock her away from the world of men forever. They believed their power was absolute, that no one could challenge the prison they had built for her. They had not accounted for the silent night, for sagas where honor is a sword that shatters injustice. Subscribe to our chronicles and let us know in the comments where our story has found you. The carriage wheels groaned over the rutted road, each jolt a fresh reminder of her fall. Livia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in the lap of her silk dress. The fine blue fabric was the last remnant of the life that had been stolen from her. Across from her, her brother Giovanni stared out at the gray, wind-swept hills, his face carved from ice. He had not spoken a word to her since they left. Their home, his silence a far heavier condemnation than any shout. She had defied him. She had refused the marriage that would have bought him a duchy, refused the hand of a cruel old man whose lands bordered their own. Her defiance was a crime not of passion, but of honor. An honor Giovanni could not comprehend. For him, honor was a title, a thing to be purchased with the currency of her happiness. In his cold eyes, she saw no flicker of kinship, no memory of the sister he grew up with. He was looking at a broken tool, a failed asset being liquidated. The carriage slowed, turning onto a gravel path that crunched under the wheels like bone. Ahead, rising from the bleak landscape, was the convent. It was not a place of gentle reflection. It was a fortress of faith, with high stone walls and narrow windows like arrow slits. It was a place designed to keep the world out, and its occupants in. A cold dread, sharper than any she had yet felt, settled deep in her bones. This was her tomb. Giovanni stepped out first, his movements crisp and impatient. He did not offer her a hand. Livia descended on her own, her silk slippers sinking into the damp earth. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of rain and wet stone. The abbess was waiting for them at the gate, a tall, gaunt woman whose face seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Her eyes, the color of slate, swept over Livia's fine dress with open disdain. The exchange between her brother and the abbess was brief. The words, clipped and devoid of emotion. A property was changing hands. A donation was being made to the church, a generous one, to ensure his sister would be given a life of piety and contemplation, to ensure she would never trouble the world of men again. Giovanni gave a curt nod, turned his back on Livia without a final glance, and climbed back into the carriage. The sound of its departure was the sound of her entire world abandoning her. Two nuns, their faces blank and impassive, led Livia inside. The great oak door closed behind them, its iron bolts sliding home with a deafening thud. The world outside vanished. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of beeswax, incense, and something else, something like despair. They took her to a small, cell-like room with a single high window and a rough wooden cot. There, the ritual of her erasure began. One nun untied the ribbons of her dress, while the other stood holding a coarse, brown wool habit. Livia did not resist. She stood as they stripped her of the blue silk, fine linen chemise, every layer of her former self. The cold air raised goose flesh on her skin, but it was the humiliation that made her tremble. Then came the shears. They were not for cutting cloth, but for shearing sheep, heavy and rusted at the hinge. The first cut was a shock, a violation. Locks of her dark hair, her pride, fell to the stone floor in lifeless piles. The cold iron scraped against her scalp and the back of her neck, brutally efficient. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of rage. Finally, they pulled the rough-spun habit over her head. The wool was scratchy against her bare skin, a constant, abrasive reminder of her new station. It smelled of lye soap and resignation. The abbess entered the cell and looked at the girl who stood before her, shorn and stripped of all vanity. "The Lady Livia is dead," the abbess declared. her voice as hollow as a winter wind. She chose vanity over family. She chose defiance over duty. God has tasked us with saving her soul from the sin of her pride. From this day forward, you have no name but sister. They did not leave her in the cell. They led her deeper into the convent's heart, through stone corridors that grew progressively darker and colder. Her bare feet recoiled from the damp chill of the floor. They stopped before a heavy door of black iron, a door that led to the novitiate's secluded wing. This was the final threshold. As a nun pulled the creaking door open, Livia knew this was the end. Her life, the one she had known, was over. The door swung shut behind her, plunging her into a profound darkness, the echo of the slamming bolt, the last sound of a world she would never see again. Weeks bled into one another, each day a perfect copy of the last. The tolling of the matins bell before dawn, prayers in the cold chapel, the endless, menial work of the convent. Livia's life was a wheel, turning on a relentless cycle of silence and submission. Her spirit had not broken, but had retreated deep within her, a silent, walled garden in the center of a barren wasteland. She scrubbed floors, mended vestments, and tended the meager kitchen garden, her movements mechanical, her face a placid mask that betrayed nothing of the fire banked within. The midday meal was the deepest point of silence in a world built of it. The nuns sat at long, dark wood refectory tables, the only sound the scraping of their spoons in wooden bowls of thin, watery pottage. The abbess watched over them all from a raised seat, her eyes missing nothing. It was in this moment of absolute, enforced peace that the outside world invaded. It began as a tremor felt through the stone floor, a rhythmic, heavy tread approaching. Then the great doors of the refectory, which had not been fully opened in years, were thrown wide with a deafening crash. Every nun froze, spoons halfway to their mouths. A man stood silhouetted against the grey light. He was a creature of another world, a world of steel and blood. Clad in dark, functional plate armor, he was a giant, his presence an act of violence in this cloistered space. He was Lord Valerius, the silent knight of the marches, a man spoken of only in hushed, fearful whispers. His helm was off, revealing a stark, grim face and eyes that burned with a cold fire. The abbess rose to her feet, her face white with fury at this sacrilege. Her authority had been challenged. In its very heart, she opened her mouth to condemn him, to order him out, but the words died in her throat as he began to walk. His armored boots echoed on the stone floor, a sound like a death knell. He paid the abbess no more heed than he would a statue, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the nuns, until it found Livia. She met his stare, and the breath caught in her throat. She saw no warmth in his eyes, no pity. She saw only an unyielding, absolute certainty, an intensity that pinned her in place. He stopped beside her table. The abbess finally found her voice, a sharp, brittle thing. "This is a house of God. You have no place here, my lord." Valerius did not even glance at her. His eyes remained locked on Livia. From within his tunic, he produced a cylinder of yellowed parchment, sealed with the faded wax of two great houses, her family's and his. He tossed it onto the table in front of the abbess. It unrolled slightly, revealing the elegant script of a contract. Made when Livia was just a child, a betrothal contract. The abbess stared at it, her mind reeling. "This is meaningless," she hissed. "She has begun her novitiate. Her life is promised to God." She prepared to deliver a sermon on the sanctity of the church, on the damnation that awaited those who would steal a bride of Christ. But before she could utter the first word of her threat, Lord Valerius did the unthinkable. He spoke. For the first time in a decade, his voice was heard. It was not a shout, but a low, rough sound, like rock grinding against rock, a sound of profound disuse, yet it held an authority that silenced the entire hall. He looked only at Livia. "Mine!" The word was an earthquake. It shattered the silence, the rules, the very foundations of Livia's prison. Valerius turned, his cloak sweeping around him, and strode toward the open doors. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had issued a command, not an invitation. Livia sat frozen, the single word echoing in her soul. She looked down at her half-eaten pottage. She looked at the abbess, whose face was a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. Then she looked toward the rectangle of grey light that was the open door, the world waiting for her. She had a choice. In the ringing silence, Livia stood. The legs of her stool scraped loudly against the floor. She did not look at the abbess or the other nuns. She walked past the tables, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, and followed the night out of the refectory. She stepped through the convent's main gate and into the open air. The daylight was blindingly bright, and she raised a hand to shield her eyes. A massive black warhorse stood waiting, its breath misting in the chill. Beside it was a gentler-looking palfrey, clearly intended for her. Lord Valerius was already swinging himself into his saddle, his movements economical and powerful. He looked down at her, his face unreadable. He had broken his vow, shattered canon law, and stolen her from the church. And he had done it all without explanation. Livia looked from his grim face back to the stone walls that had been her prison. She was free of the convent, but she had no idea if she had just been rescued or simply claimed by a new, more dangerous keeper. The journey was a silent one. For 2 days they rode, leaving the settled lands of her father's domain behind and climbing into the rugged, wind-swept hills of the marches. The landscape grew wilder, the trees thinning to scrubland, the earth turning to stone. This was a land that did not welcome men, a place of harsh beauty and constant vigilance. Lord Valerius rode as if he were a part of it, his posture never slumping, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He did not speak to her. He did not have to. His presence was a tangible thing, a shield between her and the world. When they stopped at a rough traveler's inn for the night, he secured a private room for her and stood guard outside the door himself until dawn. He was not her companion. He was her keeper, her guardian, and the line between the two felt impossibly thin. Livia watched him, trying to understand the man who had claimed her with a single word. She saw no softness in him, only an unyielding sense of duty that seemed as hard and unchangeable as the mountains around them. Near dusk on the second day, she saw it. Rocca Venti. The castle did not sit upon its hill. It grew from it. It was a fortress of grey stone and sharp angles, built for war, not for comfort. A single, formidable tower stood watch over a high curtain wall, its banner a silver hawk on a field of black, snapping in the constant wind. This was not the home of a courtly lord. It was the lair of a wolf who guarded the kingdom's edge. As they rode through the gatehouse, the men of the castle came to meet them. They were not servants in livery, but veterans, their faces weathered, their bodies marked by old battles. They moved with a quiet discipline, their respect for their lord, absolute and unspoken. An old man with a severe limp and a web of scars across his face, the castle steward, stepped forward and bowed low. The men looked at Livia, their curiosity plain, but there was no judgment in their eyes, no leering or whispering. They simply saw a woman brought home by their lord. She was now part of the fortress, and that was all that mattered. The great hall was vast, stark, and cold. The ceiling was high, lost in shadow, and the stone walls were hung with weapons, shields, and faded battle standards instead of tapestries. A massive stone hearth, big enough to roast an ox, sat empty and black. The furniture was dark, heavy oak, functional and unadorned. The air smelled of wood smoke, old stone, and steel. It was a place utterly devoid of a woman's touch, a hall that had known only the business of men and the preparations for war. The old steward, whose name was Castor, led her up a winding stone staircase to her chambers. He did not speak, but gestured for her to enter. The room was large, far larger than her cell at the convent. A heavy timbered bed stood against one wall, piled with wool blankets and fur hides. A fire had been laid in the hearth, ready to be lit. Through a tall, shuttered window, she could see the wild expanse of the borderlands stretching to the horizon. The room was clean, sparse, but it was not a cell. It was a space waiting to be filled. She was left alone. There were no orders, no instructions. A short time later, a young boy brought a tray with a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a pitcher of wine, and a basin of hot water for washing. The simple courtesy was a profound shock. It was not the silent, communal humiliation of the convent, nor the tense, performative ceremony of her father's table. It was a gesture of simple, uncomplicated care. As evening fell, Livia did not light a candle. She went to the window and pushed open the heavy wooden shutters. The wind that gave the sea castle its name rushed in, cold and clean. Below, the courtyard was quiet, the life of the fortress running on its silent, disciplined schedule. The sky was a deep, star-dusted purple. No one had spoken to her. No one had demanded anything from her. No one had looked at her with condemnation or pity. In the stark, masculine silence of this fortress, she was simply present. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the tight knot of fear and anger in her chest began to loosen. She turned from the window and walked to the hearth. Picking up the flint and steel left on the mantel, she struck a spark into the tinder. The flame caught, small at first, then growing, licking at the dry kindling. A warm, golden light pushed back the shadows, the first light she had created for herself in months. As the fire crackled to life, filling the room with its comforting warmth, Livia took a deep, shuddering breath. The air filled her lungs, clean and sharp, and for the first time, it felt entirely her own. She was in a fortress at the edge of the world, the captive of a silent, grim-faced night, but she had never felt safer. The days in Roccaventi settled into a quiet rhythm. Livia found that the fortress, for all its starkness, was a place of purpose. The men trained in the yard, the blacksmith's hammer rang from dawn till dusk, and the guards walked the battlements with a ceaseless vigilance. She was an island of stillness in this river of disciplined life, a silent observer, moving through the stone halls. The soldiers grew accustomed to her presence, offering gruff, respectful nods as she passed. She was their lord's lady. The reason for her arrival did not matter. Her presence was now a fact, as solid as the keep's stone walls. Her first act was one of quiet restoration. She found the old steward, Castor, in his office, struggling over a mountain of mismatched supply ledgers. The records were a chaotic mess of scrawled numbers and conflicting accounts. Livia watched him for a time, then simply picked up a spare quill, dipped it in ink, and pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her. Castor watched, astonished, as she began to work, her elegant, disciplined script transforming years of chaos into perfect, logical order. For a week, she worked in the dusty office, and for a week, Valerius would stand in the shadows of the doorway and watch her, unseen. He saw not a fragile noblewoman, but a mind as sharp and orderly as his own. He began to notice other things. He saw how she shivered in the corridors, her thin convent slippers offering no protection from the cold floors that seemed to leach the warmth from the very air. One morning, a pair of soft deer-hide boots appeared outside her chamber door. They were simple, unadorned, but lined with the thick, white fur of a mountain hare. There was no word of explanation. The gift was as practical and as silent as the giver. When Livia slipped her feet into them, she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fur. She found the castle's chapel, tucked away behind the great hall. It was a small, sad space, neglected for years, the altar thick with dust and the air heavy and stale. It was a place where faith had been forgotten. Livia opened the heavy shutters, letting in the clean, sharp light of the mountains. Day by day, she brought the place back to life. She scrubbed the stone floor, polished the tarnished silver chalice until it shone, and cleared the cobwebs from the rafters. In an old wooden chest, she found the keep's original banner, the silver hawk of House Valerius. It was torn and faded from some long-forgotten battle. She carefully folded it and took it with her. From his vantage on the highest battlements, Valerius could see the single candle she lit in the chapel window each evening. It was a small, lonely flame in the vast darkness of his keep, a beacon of gentle life in a world he had filled with stone and steel. A strange feeling, one he had ruthlessly suppressed for a decade, began to stir in his chest. One evening, he was sitting by the fire in the great hall, the rhythmic scrape of a whetstone against the steel of his longsword, the only sound. Livia entered, carrying the mended banner. She walked to the center of the hall, and without a word, unfurled it. The silver hawk was whole again. Her weeks of patient, meticulous stitching had restored its pride, healed its wounds. The thread she had used was a shade, lighter than the original, tracing the old tears like pale, honorable scars. Valerius stopped his work. The sound of steel on stone ceased. He looked from the banner to her face, illuminated by the firelight. He saw the hours of devotion she had poured into this task, into the symbol of his house, his family, his honor. His eyes, for the first time, held something other than grim assessment. They held a profound, aching gratitude. He lowered his head in a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of immense weight, an acknowledgement more powerful than any flowery speech. Livia understood. She inclined her own head in response, a silent acceptance. The unspoken vow had been made. She did not leave. She sat on a stool on the other side of the hearth, pulling a simple tunic of his from her mending basket and beginning a new repair. Valerius watched her for a moment longer, then returned to the slow, meditative task of sharpening his blade. The fire crackled between them, the silence in the great hall was no longer one of emptiness or grief. It was a silence that was shared, a quiet space where two solitary souls had, without a single word, begun to build a sanctuary together. The fortress had begun to feel like a home. Livia moved through its stone corridors, not as a guest, but as a part of its quiet life. One afternoon, her explorations took her to the armory. The air inside was cool and smelled of steel, oil, and worn leather. Racks of spears stood like a silent forest along one wall, while swords and axes of every shape hung in neat, practical rows. It was a room of purpose, a place where death was honed and polished, yet Livia felt no fear. She felt a quiet curiosity about this world that had shaped the man who had claimed her. In a far corner, among dented practice shields and blunted blades, her eyes fell upon a small sword. It was shorter than the others, its hilt wrapped in simple leather, its crossguard bearing the nicks of countless training bouts. It was a squire's sword, the weapon of a boy on the path to becoming a man. She lifted it, surprised by its lightness, its perfect balance. It was a tool not of a butcher but of a student of the blade. A soft scraping sound made her turn. The old steward, Castor, stood in the doorway, his limp more pronounced in the quiet of the armory. He saw the small sword in her hands, and the usual grim mask on his scarred face softened into a look of profound ancient sorrow. He walked toward her, his eyes fixed on the blade. He did not speak a full story. The men of Roccaventi did not deal in such things. He simply reached out a gnarled hand and gently touched the sword's pommel. "Leone," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse and memory. He paused, letting the name settle in the cold air. "The Lord's brother." Castor looked at Livia, his gaze heavy with the weight of what he was sharing. "The Southern War." He looked away, toward the high, barred window, as if seeing a ghost in the light. "He has not spoken since the day he brought the boy home." The steward gave a single stiff bow and limped away, leaving Livia alone with the fragments of the truth. And in the silence of the armory, the story bloomed into a terrible, vivid image. The narrator's voice filled the space, pulling back the veil of years to the memory that haunted Valerius's every waking moment. The field was a churning sea of mud and blood under a sky the color of slate. The rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, mingling with the sweat and fear of the battle. Valerius, younger and fiercer, was a whirlwind of steel at the center of the fray, his commands cutting through the din. At his side, fighting with the desperate courage of a boy trying to prove himself a man, was his brother, Leone. He was all of 16, his face still holding the softness of youth, his eyes alight with the terrible find of his first real war. The enemy line broke, then rallied, a savage flanking maneuver catching them by surprise. Valerius saw a wedge of enemy spearmen surge through their line, threatening to shatter their position. From his vantage, he saw his archers on the ridge, bows drawn and waiting. He saw the threat, and he gave the only order he could. "Archers!" he bellowed, his voice a commander's roar. "Loose!" The word was a thunderclap of authority. A black cloud of arrows rose into the grey sky, but in the chaos, in the turning tide of battle, Valerius had not seen a small group of his own vanguard. Leon, among them, pushed too far forward, charging into the very pocket of land he had just condemned. The memory, which usually played as a blur of chaos in his mind, sharpened into a single, horrific, silent moment. The rain of arrows descending, the black shafts finding their marks not in the enemy, but in the backs of his own men. He saw Leon stumble, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before he fell to his knees, an arrow buried deep in his shoulder. The battle raged on around Valerius, but for him, it had ceased to exist. He ran, shoving men aside, his sword forgotten. He knelt in the mud beside his brother, pulling him into his arms. Leona looked up at him, his eyes wide with confusion and pain, and with his last breath, he spoke his brother's name. The vow was made right there, in the blood-soaked mud, a silent scream to a merciless God. His voice, his command, had killed the one person he had sworn to protect. It was a weapon, a curse, and so he swore that it would never be used again. He would carry his silence as a penance, a shield to protect the world from the poison of his words. The cold weight of the squire's sword in Livia's hands brought her back to the present. She looked at the simple weapon, the last worldly possession of a boy, sent to his death by the brother who loved him. She understood now. The fortress, the discipline, the crushing, absolute silence. It was not a rejection of the world. It was a cage he had built for his own guilt. Later that evening, she stood on the gallery overlooking the training yard. Valerius was below, sparring with his men, his movements a blur of deadly, controlled grace. He was a perfect weapon, a master of war. But Livia no longer saw just the silent, intimidating knight. She saw the man haunted by a ghost, the brother who carried the weight of a single, fatal word. Her heart ached for him, a feeling that went deeper than gratitude or respect. It was a fierce, sudden empathy. She now knew that she was not the only broken thing he had brought to this fortress for sanctuary. The fragile peace of Roccaventi had taken root in its stony soil. The silence of the keep was no longer one of grief, but of quiet companionship. In the evenings, a new sound could be heard in the great hall, a soft, simple melody plucked from the strings of the harp Valerius had given her. Livia would play, the music a gentle stream flowing through the still air, and Valerius would sit by the fire, the harsh lines of his face softening almost imperceptibly as he listened. In these moments, the fortress felt less like a bastion of war and more like a home. This peace was shattered by the sound of a horn from the battlements. It was not the urgent, guttural cry that warned of a border raid, but a single, clear blast to announce the arrival of a formal party. Valerius, who had been watching Livia's hands move across the harp strings, was instantly on his feet. The brief glimpse of the man he might have been vanished, replaced by the grim, guarded lord of the keep. His hand rested instinctively on the pommel of his sword. From a high window overlooking the gate, Livia saw them, a procession of riders in fine livery, their colourful banners a garish intrusion on the stark landscape. At their head rode two men. One was her brother Giovanni, draped in luxurious velvets, his posture arrogant even in the saddle. The other was a man in the rich purple robes of a bishop, his face stern and self-important. A cold dread, a familiar poison seeped back into Livia's heart, undoing months of healing in a single, terrifying moment. The shadows had found her. They met in the great hall. The harp stood silent in the corner. Giovanni and Bishop Orsini stood before the hearth, radiating an unassailable authority. Valerius faced them, a pillar of dark, unmoving iron. He had not offered them wine or bread. This was not a social call. Livia stood a few paces behind him, feeling like a girl again, a pawn in a game played by powerful men. "My lord Valerius," Giovanni began, his voice smooth and laced with contempt. "We have come for my sister. It is time to end this farce. You cannot abduct a woman promised to God and expect to face no consequences." Valerius remained utterly still, his silence a more potent challenge than any angry retort. His lack of response seemed to amuse the bishop, who took a step forward, his manner one of patient, condescending power. "Your devotion to a forgotten contract is admirable, in a feudal sense," the bishop said, his voice like silk sliding over steel. "But it is irrelevant. The laws of men are superseded by the laws of God." He produced a roll of pristine parchment, tied with a ribbon of papal gold and sealed with the unmistakable crest of the Holy See. The girl began her holy novitiate. In the eyes of the Church, she is already a bride of Christ. To take her was an act of sacrilege. He unrolled the document with a theatrical snap. The Latin script was ornate and imposing. The bishop did not read it all, only the final, damning judgment. The betrothal contract between House Valerius and Livia's family was declared null and void by papal decree. Lord Valerius was commanded to return the novitiate to the convent without delay. Then came the ultimatum, the final perfect stroke of the trap. "If you refuse," the bishop continued, his voice losing its silken edge and taking on the cold hardness of a judge, "you will be declared excommunicate. An enemy of the faith, your lands will be forfeit, your title stripped, and your soul consigned to eternal damnation. Every man who stands with you, every soldier who obeys your commands, will share in your fate." The air in the hall grew thick, heavy with the weight of the threat. It was a spiritual execution. Valerius's men were loyal, hardened by years of war at his side, but he could not command them to defy God himself. He could not ask them to trade their immortal souls for loyalty to him. Giovanni smiled, a thin, cruel, triumphant expression. He had finally found a weapon that the silent knight, the master of the battlefield, could not defeat. The bishop rolled the parchment back into a neat cylinder. "You are a man of honor, my lord. I trust you will make the wise choice. We will accept your surrender of the girl at dawn." He and Giovanni turned to leave, their victory absolute. Valerius did not move. He stood like a man who had been turned to stone, his silence no longer a choice but a prison. Livia could feel the volcanic rage churning beneath his stillness, the fury of a warrior king caught in a cage of words and faith. She looked at her brother's triumphant smirk, at the bishop's cold, pious eyes, and understood. They had not come to negotiate. They had come to watch her sanctuary burn. The night that followed was the longest of Livia's life. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over Roccaventi, the silence of men contemplating a battle they were doomed to lose. Livia found Valerius in the armory. He was not raging, not despairing. He was preparing. By the light of a single torch, he was methodically checking the straps and plates of his armor, oiling the joints, ensuring every piece was perfect. He was a warrior preparing to meet his end, to fall on a sword of faith and politics that his own blade could not parry. He would die to defend his honor, the last thing he had left. To watch him was to watch a man building his own tomb. Despair, cold and familiar, tried to wrap its tendrils around Livia's heart. The helpless girl from the convent wanted to weep, to surrender, but that girl was gone. Months of quiet purpose in this stark fortress had forged something new in her. She would not be a passive victim in the destruction of the man who had saved her. She would not watch her sanctuary be torn down. A thought, faint at first, then sharp as a shard of glass, cut through her fear. The bishop had declared the contract void, but he had only seen Valerius's copy. In her father's haste to dispose of her, had he forgotten the duplicate? She remembered her days organizing the keep's archives, the dusty chests of documents, some bearing the seal of her own house. With a stolen candle, she descended into the cold, silent archives. The air was thick with the smell of aging parchment and forgotten ink. Her frantic search began. She broke the seals on old chests, her hands shaking as she sifted through land grants, trade agreements, and decades of correspondence. The night wore on, the silence of the keep a constant pressure, a reminder that the dawn was coming. The candle burned low, its flame sputtering, and a cold dread began to seep into her. She was running out of time. Then she saw it. Tucked at the bottom of a chest, filled with old maps, was a heavy scroll case of polished oak, bearing her father's crest. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she broke the dry, brittle wax of the seal and slid the parchment out. It was the contract. She scanned the dense, formal script, her heart pounding against her ribs. It seemed identical. Her hope began to wither. But then, near the very end, she saw it. A separate paragraph, written in a different, more forceful hand, the ink darker than the rest. It was a section she had never seen before, appended below her father's signature. It was a royal codicil, a king's clause, signed with the bold, unmistakable flourish of the king himself. It stated that because the union of their two houses was a matter of strategic importance, securing the kingdom's most volatile border, the betrothal was not merely a private contract but an affair of the state. As such, it could not be dissolved by any power, spiritual or temporal, save a direct decree from the throne. The horn blew from the battlements. Dawn. Livia ran from the archives, the scroll clutched in her hand like a weapon. She found Valerius in the main bailey. He was clad in his full, black battle armor, his helmet tucked under his arm. He stood alone, a solitary pillar of defiance, ready to face his annihilation. His men watched from the walls, their faces grim, torn between loyalty and fear. He saw her approaching, saw the scroll, saw the blazing fire in her eyes. The deep despair in his expression was replaced by a flicker of stunned, cautious hope. He did not know her plan, but he trusted her. As she walked toward the main gate, he fell into step beside her, his armored boots echoing her determined stride. Giovanni and the bishop were waiting, mounted and flanked by their guards. A smug, proprietary air hung about them. They had come to collect their prize. "I am pleased to see you have chosen wisdom over a futile death, my lord," the bishop said, his voice oozing false piety. It was Livia who answered. She stepped forward, out of Valerius's shadow, and held up the scroll. "Your Grace," she began, her voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority no one in that courtyard had ever heard from her. "You have presented a decree from the Holy Father in Rome, but you appear to have forgotten a more immediate authority." Her eyes flashed. "That of your king." She unrolled the parchment, and in a loud, unwavering voice, read the king's clause. Each word fell like a hammer blow. When she was finished, she looked directly at the bishop, her gaze as hard as steel. "To remove me from this keep is to violate a royal decree. It is to interfere in the security of the realm. That is a matter far beyond sacrilege. It is treason." A stunned, absolute silence fell over the courtyard. The bishop's face, moments before so full of righteous power, turned the color of ash. Giovanni stared at his sister as if seeing her for the first time, his mouth agape. They were utterly defeated, their perfect trap sprung, their sacred authority rendered worthless by a forgotten line of ink. Livia slowly rolled the parchment. Valerius moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with her, his presence an unbreachable wall. He placed a gauntleted hand on the hilt of his sword, a silent, final statement. They stood together, her quiet wisdom and his unyielding strength, a single, unbreakable shield. Utterly humiliated, with no response and no recourse, the bishop turned his horse without another word. Giovanni followed, his face a mask of thwarted rage. Their grand procession, which had arrived with such pomp and power, retreated in disgraced silence. As they rode out the gate, the first rays of the rising sun crested the battlements, bathing Livia and Valerius in a golden, victorious light. The rest of the day passed in a state of quiet awe. A palpable sense of relief settled over Roccaventi, as tangible as the morning sun warming its stone walls. The men of the garrison moved with a lighter step, their gruff salutes to Livia now holding a new, profound respect. She had met the enemy not with steel, but with a mind as sharp as any blade, and had saved them all from a war they could not have won. That evening the great hall was different. The heavy, oppressive tension had vanished, replaced by a quiet, communal pride. The old steward, Castor, in an unprecedented show of celebration, issued a ration of strong ale to every man. At the high table, Livia and Valerius ate in their usual silence. But it was a silence transformed. It was no longer a space of caution and observation, but one of deep, shared understanding. Across the flickering candlelight, there, eyes met, and for the first time, Livia saw an unguarded warmth in his gaze, a soft light that transformed his stern features. After the meal, as the men's quiet conversations filled the hall, Valerius slipped away. Livia felt his absence immediately. She knew with a certainty that came from the heart where he had gone. She found him in the chapel. The small space, once a forgotten pocket of dust and shadows, was now filled with the gentle, flickering glow of 24 candles. He wasn't kneeling. He was standing vigil before the small stone niche that held his brother's sword. In the soft light, his face was a mask of profound, unguarded grief, the sorrow of a decade etched into his soul. He was alone with his ghosts, the silent lord, in his most secret and broken place. Livia carried the mended banner, the great silver hawk she had painstakingly restored. She walked not to him, but to the simple stone altar that stood just below the memorial. With slow, reverent movements, she unfolded the heavy cloth and draped it over the altar. The proud, whole sigil of his house now covered the cold stone, its restored honor a silent answer to the symbol of his unending guilt. It was a gesture of healing, a quiet declaration that his family's legacy was not just its sorrow, but its resilience. He turned slowly from the memorial to look at her. The candlelight swam in his eyes, betraying the deep well of emotion he kept locked behind his wall of silence. In that moment, he was not the fearsome lord of the marches, not the master of war. He was a man seeing light for the first time after a lifetime in the dark. He saw the woman who had brought order to his chaos, light to his forgotten chapel, and victory to his hopeless battle. He took one step toward her, then another. He raised his hand, a hand scarred and calloused from 1,000 battles. For a moment it hovered in the space between them, hesitant. Then, with a tenderness that defied his entire being, he reached out and gently tucked a stray lock of her short hair behind her ear. His rough fingers brushed against her skin, and the touch was a vow, a confession, a poem written in a language more profound than words. Livia closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for a heartbeat. It was a complete surrender, an act of perfect trust. She then raised her own hand and placed it over his, pressing his palm to her cheek, holding it there. Her touch was her answer. In the sacred quiet of the candlelit chapel, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the symbols of a healed future, the unspoken vow was sealed. They were no longer protector and protected lord and lady. In that silent, gentle gesture, they had finally, truly, found their sanctuary. They had found it in each other. Years passed. The winds still swept across the high hills of the marches, but they no longer seemed to carry a scent of loneliness from the walls of Roccaventi. The fortress stood as strong as ever, a vigilant guardian on the kingdom's edge, but within its walls, a profound change had taken place. The sound of a child's laughter now echoed in the courtyard, a sound brighter and stronger than the clash of training swords. The great hall, once a cavern of stone and shadows, was now warmed by colorful tapestries Livia had woven with her own hands. The scent of baking bread and roasting herbs drifted from the kitchens, a constant, comforting promise of hearth and home. In the bailey, the small herb garden she had started had flourished into a vibrant, sprawling space, bursting with not only useful plants, but with bright, cheerful flowers that grew in defiant splashes of color against the gray stone. In that garden, a little boy with his father's dark, serious eyes was carefully constructing a miniature fortress from twigs and pebbles. A few feet away, his older sister, who had her mother's gentle smile and quiet grace, sat weaving a crown from dandelions. They were the living, breathing proof of the peace their parents had forged, a union of strength and wisdom made real. From the high battlements, Livia and Valerius watched them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the familiar, comfortable silence between them, a testament to their deep bond. She was the serene and confident lady of the keep, her presence the quiet heart of its new life. He was still the formidable lord, the warden of the marches, but the decade of profound grief had finally receded from his eyes, replaced by a deep, steady calm. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. His voice, once a weapon he had locked away in a prison of guilt, was now a sound of pure comfort, a low, gentle rumble meant only for her. "Look, my love," he whispered, his gaze moving from their children below to the vast sun-drenched lands that stretched to the horizon. "Our peace." Livia leaned her head against his armored shoulder, her heart full. She placed her hand over his where it rested on the cold stone of the parapet. His fingers immediately intertwined with hers, a familiar, possessive warmth. Together they watched the sun dip below the rugged hills, painting the sky in strokes of gold and purple. The banner of the silver hawk snapped in the evening breeze, no longer the symbol of a solitary warrior's endless vigil, but the proud standard of a family. It was the flag of a home built on courage, a love forged in silence, and a peace that had, at long last, been won.